The King's Avatar, Chapter 595, Audio Source, WuShoWorldAudiobook.com. Chapter 595. Rush upwards just like this. Even though Zhang Yu knew that this person was God Yichu, Zhang Jiali was also a god. He didn't think that Yichu had a 100% chance of winning. In their last confrontation, unrivaled Super Hottie helped to secure the boss for tyrannical ambition, but it wasn't good to underestimate their opponent. Against an opponent like Zhang Jiali, Zhang Yu hoped that his trump card would be serious. But in the moment it took him to blink, unrivaled Super Hottie had already led his ragtag bunch towards the North Bridge while saying, "Let's move over here. We'll have a better view." The big guilds that were helpless against Dazzling Spring turned to look, and what they saw was a poverty-stricken group from tyrannical ambition. They all secretly thought they were some sort of secret weapon. Even tyrannical ambition's own players were baffled by this sight. Zhang Yu's patience had almost reached its limit, but he could only walk up to unrivaled Super Hottie. "How do you plan on taking care of Dazzling Spring?" Zhang Yu asked. "I'll just rush upwards and take care of him," unrivaled Super Hottie replied. "How?" Zhang Yu continued to bear it. But unrivaled Super Hottie hesitated. "How do I explain it to you?" Zhang Yu's patience finally ran out and he asked, "Fine, how do you want us to cover you? After I rush upwards, all you need to do is to keep the Blossom Valley players in check," unrivaled Super Hottie said. "Fine." Zhang Yu was done. What he wanted to know was how unrivaled Super Hottie would turn the tides for them, but invincible Super Hottie's answer was always, "Just rush upwards. Just rush upwards." What nonsense. Everybody knew how to rush upwards, but the problem was they couldn't. Zhang Yu wanted to know how, but unrivaled Super Hottie appeared as if he couldn't give a proper explanation. Zhang Yu anxiously followed unrivaled Super Hottie to the edge of the bridge. The other players noticed unrivaled Super Hottie's presence and the fact that their guild leader created a new party. They rubbed their fists in anticipation of the upcoming action, but unrivaled Super Hottie sent a nodding emoticon and said, "I'm rushing in." And then, he just rushed in. Simple, rough, no tricks, no deception, and no numerical superiority. Unrivaled Super Hottie stepped onto the bridge alone. Dazzling Spring and the Blossom Valley players had stayed longer than unrivaled Super Hottie on the bridge. Despite that, the boss threw a glance at him the moment he touched the bridge, though he didn't launch an attack. It was one of the specialties of the boss. The old man cared a lot whenever somebody stepped onto the bridge. The poor NPC. He'd never understand that to prevent anybody from ever setting foot on the North Bridge, all he need to do was leave the North Bridge. Players wouldn't usually try and cross a broken bridge like this one. It was too risky to cross the river using it. The boss didn't divert his attacks towards unrivaled Super Hottie, but the Blossom Valley players couldn't hold themselves back. The moment they saw the knight, unrivaled Super Hottie, the aggro of the Blossom Valley's elites immediately shifted towards him. This is what it meant to provoke with only one's looks. Nobody make a move. Blossom Valley's guild leader Blooming Blossom said to stabilize the emotions of his guild members. Blossom Valley's current combat style was built around Dazzling Spring. The player was actually very quiet even among Blossom Valley's inner circle. He would, however, agree to participate whenever invited to a competition for a wild boss. He didn't talk much, just like the average party member, and would only speak a sentence or two when need. Everybody could guess the identity of Dazzling Spring. Even when he stayed silent, his position as a core member of the guild was already set. Blossom Valley's attacks were basically adjusted according to Dazzling Spring's attacks. Seeing that Dazzling Spring didn't take any immediate action, Blooming Blossom stopped his men from attacking as well. In the few seconds of hesitation, unrivaled Super Hottie had completed 3 jumps. Continuous and quick, unrivaled Super Hottie began jumping. Although he wasn't as stylish as Dazzling Spring, it was still a sight to see a heavily armored character moving with such agility. There were no intervals between his jumps, as if he could do it even with eyes closed. Within moments, Unrivaled Super Hottie was already halfway across. Dazzling Spring chose that exact moment to launch a sudden attack. Bullets and grenades flew towards Unrivaled Super Hottie. The players, who tried to charge onto the North Bridge, were faced with similar attacks. In their own confusion, some fell off the bridge due to their own mistakes, while others were thrown off due to the shock waves and explosions, while quite a number of them died from just the damage alone. Unrivaled Super Hottie was different. He showed no hesitation and carried on jumping upwards, darting between the visual disruptions created by Dazzling Spring. He really is rushing in? Zhang Yu was speechless. Unrivaled Super Hottie braved through Dazzling Spring's attacks and continued his jump upwards. Can he make it? Even if he didn't die, how much health would he have left by the time he reaches the top? Zhang Yu was worried. Clerics, go see if you guys can heal him up. Zhang Yu immediately gave the order. The clerics from Tyrannical Ambition immediately went into action. They moved forward and healed Unrivaled Super Hottie, but with Dazzling Spring's continuous attacks, they couldn't even spot their target and couldn't land their skills on their target. They tried very hard to grasp any chance they could to locate Unrivaled Super Hottie. After all, Dazzling Spring needed to handle the boss as well, so he couldn't pay full attention to Unrivaled Super Hottie. The advantage in numbers had finally been made obvious at that moment. Even though most clerics failed to grasp an opportunity to heal him, but with their sheer numbers, some of them eventually got lucky. Unrivaled Super Hottie's health was maintained just like that. But as Unrivaled Super Hottie reached a new height, he had moved out of range of the cleric's healing skills. Some of the clerics moved forward in a desperate attempt to catch up with Unrivaled Super Hottie and set foot on the North Bridge. The boss viewed every living soul who dared to set foot on the North Bridge as the same. He glared coldly at them one by one. Dazzling Spring, on the other hand, didn't share the boss's sentiment. When Unrivaled Super Hottie set foot on the bridge, WuxiaWorldAudio.com, he ignored him, but the moment the other players were on the bridge, Dazzling Spring stopped his harassment towards Unrivaled Super Hottie and began bombarding the players with his attacks. Two clerics fell into the river instantly, their fates unknown. Dazzling Spring didn't hold back against other players. But did he hold back against Unrivaled Super Hottie? The crowd soon realized that he did not. They realized that it was a trap. If getting closer to Dazzling Spring was Unrivaled Super Hottie's objective, he had already closed two-thirds of the distance, but right after he hit the two-thirds mark, he lost his support from the clerics. The remaining one-third of the journey would be one where Dazzling Spring could take care of Unrivaled Super Hottie with his advantage in range. He could even cooperate with the Blossom Valley players to deal with Unrivaled Super Hottie. He didn't attack Unrivaled Super Hottie because he knew that the guy was good, hence he set up a trap for him. With Unrivaled Super Hottie's current awkward position, maybe Dazzling Spring would make a move. The problem was that Dazzling Spring didn't allow Unrivaled Super Hottie to freely move around. He kept on harassing him. But Dazzling Spring's next wave of attack showed the players that they were wrong. To deal with an opponent who is on an entirely different level, one must also use some unconventional methods. The 100 Blossom style, that was enough to suppress the average player, was just showing an opening when used on Unrivaled Super Hottie. Totally ignoring him would be too obvious. His intention of seemingly eliminating Unrivaled Super Hottie earlier on was the real trap. The moment Unrivaled Super Hottie placed himself in this awkward position where he couldn't move forward and could no longer retreat, that was exactly the best time to go all out. Dazzling Spring had been waiting for that exact moment for a long time. He had even secretly made preparations. Unrivaled Super Hottie's position was exposed to him. That was at the top of the bridge and the Blossom Valley players below. Those who could hit Unrivaled Super Hottie had already launched their attacks. Unrivaled Super Hottie immediately began to show caution. The landing spots around him were all covered by Blossom Valley players. Even the bystanders were beginning to feel despair for Unrivaled Super Hottie, but he was still jumping forward and upwards. He was still rushing upwards. Zhang Yu had a strange feeling in his heart after observing the scene. The pro-god, who he supposedly hated the most, was currently the one who he respected the most. Always moving forward, never giving up. Zhang Yu believed that the captain of tyrannical ambition, Han Wenqing, would have done the same. But such a method would bring more harm than good in certain times. This was exactly what was happening to Unrivaled Super Hottie. If he wanted to move forward, he would need to bear the brunt of the attack. Firm defense, spell reflection, shield wall, night defensive skills were used one after the other in perfect rhythm as Unrivaled Super Hottie continued his rush upwards. The night players on scene were already worshipping him. It still wasn't enough though. The opponent's attacks weren't that easy to deal with. Even though Unrivaled Super Hottie was persistent, if he couldn't escape his opponent's attacks, his health would eventually hit zero. Who asked you to show off? Zhang Yu was depressed. He classified Unrivaled Super Hottie's actions as showing off. He couldn't accept the fact that the person he hated the most was so similar to their captain Han Wenqing. At that unexpected moment, a white light showered Unrivaled Super Hottie. It was a cleric's heel, and chapter.
The King's Avatar, Chapter 596, Audio Source, Wuxia Chapter 596 The Sneaky Cleric. Heals were instant cast, and the more it healed, the longer the cooldown and the higher the aggro gained. Even in PvP, high aggro generation couldn't be overlooked. Even though players weren't bound to aggro like NPCs were, this type of aggro generating skills were still hated by players. The skill that had been cast on Unrivaled Super Hottie was an ultimate heal. Holy Heal. The amount of HP healed was enormous. The timing of the skill could be known by the tyrannical ambition elites that were in the same party as Unrivaled Super Hottie. They clearly saw that Unrivaled Super Hottie's HP had just been about to reach zero, but then Holy Heal was cast. One could only imagine the amount of aggro generated by the skill. The Blossom Valley players had given it their all to attack Unrivaled Super Hottie. At that point, they were just counting down until Unrivaled Super Hottie would die, but suddenly a Holy Heal came out. Clerics didn't have to be ferocious, nor did they have many ways to deal damage, but performing well at these crucial moments could cause their opponents to cough blood. The psychological damage was immeasurable. Who was it? It was the question in everybody's head. They began looking around, trying to find the caster of the heal. They found out very soon. On the North Bridge, a cleric was standing on top of a broken railing a few units above the ground. He had his arms extended with a cross in his hands, as if waiting for the cooldown to be over so that he could cast another spell. He appeared to be paying attention to where his feet were, as if afraid to fall down. This wiped out any semblance of style and made him look dirty. And then everybody could see the 2 rows of words above his head. Tyrannical Ambition 7th Branch Guild. Little Cold Hands. Who's that? Even players from Tyrannical Ambition had this question on their minds. They had never heard of this name before. And watching the guy standing at that spot carefully, everybody present could already picture it in their minds. A cleric called Little Cold Hands snuck up to that spot when nobody was paying attention and had cast a heal. Was it only a coincidence? That was the conclusion reached by most of the players, as Little Cold Hands' movements didn't seem like that of an expert. Some people were still doubtful about the situation. What happened next left him speechless. The Blossom Valley players attacking unrivaled Super Hottie discovered Little Cold Hands at the same time. They hated the Holy Heel very much. They weren't even in the mood to analyze Little Cold Hand's actions. They were mad that somebody had snuck behind them and used a Holy Heel when they weren't paying attention. It would never have happened under normal circumstances. Unrivaled Super Hottie was just too good. Everybody's attention was focused on knocking him off the bridge and ignored everything else. They were lucky that it was only one player. What would have happened if all of these guilds had seized the opportunity to rush onto the bridge? The Blossom Valley players couldn't help but feel afraid after considering the scenario. The players from the other guilds also noticed the lost opportunity and were filled with regret. That was a chance that unrivaled Super Hottie fought so hard for, and were just standing around watching. Quote, "There was even a tyrannical ambition player who said it out loud. He should have given us a signal." Someone said, "Do you think he had time to do that in that situation?" Somebody replied, "While they still basking in regret, the Blossom Valley players had already taken action." Attack after attack was launched towards Little Cold Hands. Facing all of these attacks, Little Cold Hands' only reaction was a loud, "Oh no," and he fell into the water. He was not an expert. It had just been a coincidence. Everybody that had their hopes up for Little Cold Hands became speechless. Any one of them could have lasted longer even if they weren't as good as unrivaled Super Hottie. While everybody else was shaking their heads and sighing, their attention shifted once again to Little Cold Hands. They had unexpectedly forgotten about the impact of the Holy Heel on the outcome of the battle. Great job. It was a praise from unrivaled Super Hottie himself. But he could not be heard by the ones below because of the sound effects of all the attacks being thrown at him. The only person who realized the value of that Holy Heel other than Yizhu would be Zhang Jiale. Their judgment and game sense were obviously way higher than normal players. Not good. Zhang Jiale thought the moment the Holy Heel landed on unrivaled Super Hottie. If he had seen the cleric sneaking up, he would have prevented it. The problem was that he hadn't. He was at the highest point of the bridge, unlike the other Blossom Valley players and the players from the other guilds. They were looking upwards, so it was natural for them to have missed Little Cold Hands, but for Zhang Jiale, he had a bird's eye view, so he should have spotted the person. But he hadn't. It was all due to the large amount of AoE attacks he and the Blossom Valley players had dished out against unrivaled Super Hottie. These attacks were mainly long-range with bright visual effects like cannon fire or spells. This was the 100 Blossom style. However, it didn't mean Zhang Jiale could see through the visual distractions either. In that instant, he realized the root of the problem. This cleric had used the visual effects of their attacks to hide himself from their view. The Holy Heel that he had cast had been on point. Blossom Valley's attacks were more for support rather than damage. That was the reason why unrivaled Super Hottie was able to survive all those attacks for so long. Zhang Jiale made such an arrangement because he knew the real identity of his opponent. He believed that his opponent would seize any opportunity given to him. It would not be wise to challenge the judgment of an experienced opponent. Zhang Jiale understood the philosophy deeply as one of the experienced gods. That was why his attacks against unrivaled Super Hottie had been weak but unavoidable attacks. This was also why Zhang Jiale had baited unrivaled Super Hottie to such a height. If unrivaled Super Hottie wanted to escape, he would only have one choice: jump into the river. But suddenly a cleric and a Holy Heel turned the tides. Unrivaled Super Hottie's health was higher than Zhang Jiale had expected, and with his persistence in rushing towards him, which was originally meaningless to Zhang Jiale, was now a huge threat. White light glowed around Unrivaled Super Hottie. Night Spirit. Unrivaled Super Hottie activated Night Spirit. Zhang Jiale knew that this was a very crucial moment. The pressure was huge. To suffer an attack from a god like Yichu while under attack from the Northbridge Mage as well wouldn't be easy for anyone to deal with. Charge. Unrivaled Super Hottie activated the skill, rushing upwards. Zhang Jiale knew that with the Holy Heal, Unrivaled Super Hottie would close in on him unless he managed to widen the distance. Zhang Jiale chose to evade. Dazzling Spring prepared to escape, attempting to kite Unrivaled Super Hottie. At that moment, Unrivaled Super Hottie waved at him. FCK. He was killed because of this very skill in their previous confrontation. Provoke. WuxaWorldAudio.com. Unrivaled Super Hottie had cast Provoke on him. His character moved towards Unrivaled Super Hottie. Under the influence of Provoke, the character still retained intelligence. The character would still retain its auto-pathing instead of falling right down below. But this alone was lethal. Zhang Jiale's aim was for Dazzling Spring to stay as far away as possible from Unrivaled Super Hottie, not get closer. It was too late. He only had Blossom Valley players around him. Although they were experts in the game, they would never compare to pro players. Nobody could help him in time. Dazzling Spring leapt high into the air. A light lit up Dazzling Spring in mid-air. It was a focus from a cleric, removing the provoke effect. The cleric might have thought that the skill was timely and stylish, but Zhang Jiale wanted to cry. Because of the Northbridge's terrain, his movements toward Unrivaled Super Hottie weren't just simple sprinting. He needed to jump. His Dazzling Spring had a very high jump capability. That particular jump was high and far, and with the system's auto-pathing, he landed in a very safe spot. But this was not what Zhang Jiale wanted. You couldn't just turn in mid-air like you could on the ground. But Zhang Jiale was a god and Dazzling Spring was a gunner. Zhang Jiale immediately surveyed the terrain and immediately fired out several shots. With his gun's recoil, he managed to stop his character's forward movement. Dazzling Spring stopped in mid-air, but there was no landing spot. When Dazzling Spring dropped down, there would be a low landing spot. Zhang Jiale had shot his bullets perfectly. But at that moment, Unrivaled Super Hottie leapt into the air, and his sword slashed down at Dazzling Spring. Heroic leap. The same trick again. Won't you ever get tired of it? Zhang Jiale coughed out blood. End chapter. The King's Avatar. Chapter 597. Audio source. WuxaWorldAudiobook.com. Chapter 597. I'll be leaving first because I've got stuff to do. Unrivaled Super Hottie crashed down with heroic leap. Compared to the free-falling Dazzling Spring, who knew how much faster he dropped, it would be too late even if Zhang Jiale wanted to dodge. He could only curse a few times. Truthfully, he might have anticipated that this would happen, but the instant he jumped after being provoked, he already knew that the situation was very bad. It was true that as his god, he had the capability to dispel the taunt and switch directions in mid-air, but unfortunately, his opponent was also a god. His opponent wouldn't be surprised that he could do it. In other words, when his opponent used Provoke, his opponent had already prepared to counter his next actions. The knight's sword smashed into Dazzling Spring's body. The displacement induced by the attack made it so that he missed his original landing spot, causing Dazzling Spring to continue to fall. Zhang Jiale hastily looked for a possible landing spot, but Unrivaled Super Hottie unexpectedly continued to pressure him, following him downwards. This guy, Zhang Jiale, was already aware that Yichu wasn't thinking about landing anywhere after hitting him down from his high point. Right now, Yichu was planning on dragging him into the water. As a result, everyone just watched as Unrivaled Super Hottie struck Dazzling Spring with a heroic leap and then dropped rapidly. Unrivaled Super Hottie still had Knight's Spirit activated. A streak of white light followed behind him like a shooting star. Dazzling Spring tried to escape from his predicament by attacking a few times, which just added to the splendor of the shooting star. However, his efforts were in vain. The two fell straight into the water, leaving behind a trace of their trajectory as well as a splash that hit the Blossom Valley players on the bridge. Everyone was dumbfounded. Most of the players were still thinking about the stealthy heal by Little Cold Hands, who had quickly been hit into the water by the enemy. Who would have thought that those two experts would suddenly fall into the water together? The river was vast and extremely deep at the center. When the two experts hit the water, they were immediately swept away by the current like all the other players. The players still hadn't registered what had just happened and stared dumbly at the fast-flowing currents beneath the bridge until a huge fireball suddenly exploded on the bridge. Several Blossom Valley players cried out as they tumbled into the water below. Only then did everyone wake up. Even though the two experts had left, the North Bridge Mage was still there. Their true purpose was to fight for the boss, not watch two experts have a go at it. But without Dazzling Spring, Blossom Valley had lost their foothold. Even though a portion of their players had grasped the high ground, how could they have the same level of control over the situation as Zhang Jiale? Let alone suppressing the onslaught of enemy players rushing onto the North Bridge. With Dazzling Spring gone, the North Bridge Mages was completely focused on them. Because they had stayed on the bridge longer, the North Bridge Mage placed priority on him over the players who had just stepped onto the bridge. All sorts of spells flew towards the players from Blossom Valley. With their skill level, one mistake meant falling into the water. The terrain and the boss made it too difficult for them to save the situation. What's more, the enemy guilds had suffered under Blossom Valley's hands for the past 2 weeks. They had a tacit agreement to not fight against each other and first allied together to vent the frustration built up over the last 2 weeks on Blossom Valley's players. In an instant, the players from Blossom Valley turned into dumplings and were struck into the water. If a player was thrown into the water, it didn't matter if the player died or not. The players from Blossom Valley were wiped clean. The North Bridge Mage no longer had too many targets left and fired spells randomly. Everyone was feeling very excited. What a familiar scene. This was what the fight for the North Bridge Mage should look like. The boss battle power wasn't actually too frightening, but the hard part was the location. 1. It was too easy to find him. 2. The terrain was difficult, so the battle always turned into a huge mess. Once the North Bridge Mage started casting spells randomly, players constantly fell into the water. No one was a stranger to this scene though. Everyone calmly faced the boss. Without the expert from Blossom Valley, everyone felt 100 times more confident. Only Jiang Yu was uneasy. The North Bridge Mage was something tyrannical ambition need. The formidable Dazzling Spring had been taken care of by Yichu, but in this type of chaotic battle, no guild had an absolute grasp on victory. Tyrannical ambition was no exception. At this moment, they need a peak expert watching over in order to have a better chance. Jiang Yi cautiously commanded his troops, while hastily asking Unrivaled Super Hottie for his situation. He hoped that Unrivaled Super Hottie hadn't died and hopefully landed nearby, so that he could hurry up and return. This wasn't impossible. In Glory, every character automatically knew how to swim, so they usually wouldn't drown. However, once a player fell into the water, the current was too rapid, making it difficult for them to figure out their position in the water. If they couldn't find the surface to replenish their air supply, wouldn't they suffocate? In addition, there were all sorts of rocks in the water, which would deal damage if collided into. The faster the current, the more damage the rocks dealt. Characters who fell into the water didn't have much health to begin with. Before they could drink any potions, the rocks would kill them. Yichu was a god though, so Jiang Yu felt like he wouldn't die because of these reasons. Normal players would panic and be unable to figure out their position, but a god shouldn't have that problem, right? As a result, Jiang Yu expected unrivaled Super Hottie to have reached shore already. But then again, Dazzling Spring wasn't a simple character either. He probably wouldn't die in the river so easily either. If he came back to the battle, that would be troublesome too. Perhaps the two got out of the water at the same time and were fighting right now. Who knew how many situations Jiang Yu had thought of already? Unrivaled Super Hottie soon returned a message. Jiang Yu hastily looked at it and coughed a mouthful of blood. I have stuff to do, so I'll be leaving first. Good luck. What was this? What the FCK was this? What do you mean you have stuff to do, so you'll be leaving first? What's more important than this, wild boss? Jiang Yu was so angry, his hands were shaking. He replied, the boss is such an important matter. You can't just leave like that. Brother, I'm still busy forming a new team. I don't have the time to keep playing with you. Unrivaled Super Hottie answered back, making Jiang Yu feel like his soul had parted with his body. This guy wasn't even trying to hide his identity anymore. If a spy revealed himself, it meant he had already completed his mission, so he didn't care anymore. But the problem was that they knew his identity as a spy before, so why did he feel hurt after seeing his "I'm actually a spy" personality? In this type of situation, he should be saying, I already knew you were a spy. WatchOurWorldAudio.com. Quote, it should have been a beautiful moment. See, even though he knew, why couldn't he say it? If I return, I won't be there to help you fight for the boss, but rather to take the boss for myself. Are you sure you want me to come back? Unrivaled Super Hottie followed up. See you later. Jiang Yu decided. See you later. I don't want to see you ever again. Jiang Yu changed his words. Ha ha ha. Unrivaled Super Hottie laughed and added a laughing emoji. Tears streaked down Jiang Yu's face. Okay, there's no point in placing any hope on him any longer. I should hurry up and lead my troops seriously. I have to win this boss with my own effort. Now that there were extraordinary experts causing chaos, it was up to each guild's strength. They still had a chance. So at this moment, Jiang Yu heard a firm voice coming from the other end of the North Bridge. Hold your positions. You have to hold your position. Protect the cleric and send the cleric forward. Are gonna go up with an aerial fire. You're still not going up and you dare call yourself an expert. There doesn't need to be anyone over there. Thieves just place a few traps. Don't just rush in there. Go around. Be a bit more dirtier and despicable, okay? Dude, you're an assassin. Why are you charging forward like you're a knight? Over there. Over there is over there. The FC King enemies understand, but you don't understand. Give coordinates. If I give coordinates, the enemies will also hear, and it looks to me like the enemies respond faster than you dim-witted fools. You idiot. If you fall into the water, you're dead. TSK TSK TSK. Who was this guy? His firm voice carried an unbelievable amount of confidence. All of the players gathered here were the elite experts of each guild and the top players of the heavenly domain. Even Jiang Yu wouldn't have such confidence when talking to his troops. Just who was this guy? Jiang Yu looked towards that direction, but he couldn't identify the speaker. However, the other end of the North Bridge was gradually became more and more stable. The guild that had grasped the upper hand was Samsara. Was it because of that person's leading? Another unknown expert. Jiang Yu's heart palpitated. He had a bad premonition. It felt like this fight for the boss would be another wasted effort. Not far from the North Bridge, on the surface of the river, a huge tree trunk was floating on top. A wave rose up. There seemed to be someone inside. The instant the wave rose, a character suddenly jumped out and turned 180 degrees, landing on the tree trunk. When he landed, he held a gun in one hand and a grenade in the other hand. His gaze stared at the incoming wave. It was dazzling spring. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Zhang Jialei didn't loosen his guard. He knew that a certain someone wouldn't die in the water like that. As he was swept along with the current, he hadn't been able to find a suitable place to stand until now. There was no way that guy would be unable to get out of the current. Right when he was thinking this, an abnormal movement came from the wave. Zhang Jialei immediately noticed it. He focused and a knight burst out of the water. He held a sword in his hand and landed majestically on the tree trunk. The same thing again. Zhang Jialei saw heroic leap and shouted angrily. He fired his gun and threw his grenade at him. What are you talking about? If I didn't use it, how else was I supposed to get up here? The knight said as he landed. End chapter.